Hey, Karim here, founder of Nude Human Consulting. The Coffee with Karim podcast aims to provide Muslims and people of all backgrounds a space to share their life gifts, meet dynamic guests, and enhance the human experience one cup of coffee at a time. Sit back and sip. Welcome to another show of Coffee with Karim. Today, Daniel Haqiqatjou joins me once again for another very interesting and deep subject. Warning, nerd alert. We're going to be discussing the idea of evolutionary biology and what reflections we can take from this from a scientific perspective, as well as a theological and Islamic perspective. Daniel, thanks again for coming on the show today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So I wanted to, first of all, I just got to put it out there. I'm no expert in biology. I mean, my strengths are in, psychology, human sciences, religious studies. And I know you have a background in the philosophy of science and physics, so you probably got some more concepts down than me. So I'm going to kind of be the guy who asks a lot of questions and tries to understand. So be patient with me, okay? So Daniel, maybe you can start us off by sharing what's your understanding of biological evolution.
So there's two major components of evolutionary biology. One is genealogical continuity, which is this idea that everything is on the same tree of life and that there's a common ancestry of all organisms. So it means that all the animals and all the organisms that are around today are essentially cousins. They're related to each other biologically. And if you want to find the common ancestor between two species, you have to go back in time. And generally, the more divergent or different two organisms are, the further back in time the common ancestor is. So, for example, the common ancestor for human beings and chimpanzees is presumed to be, not that far back compared to the common ancestor between human beings and cats, or human beings and frogs, or human beings and an amoeba, right? So as the two species are more divergent, the common ancestor is farther back, but everything is on the same family tree. And so that's one component of evolutionary biology, and it's a component that predates Darwin. It's actually an idea that has its origin predating Darwin, and it was something that atheists and non-theists generally held, as well as deists. They felt that this was a more naturalistic understanding of how human beings and life in general came to be, rather than divine intervention. You have this slow progression of life, and everything comes from other life. So there's nothing that just spontaneously generates. So that's genealogical continuity, and then so that's the what, basically. That's the what of evolution. And then there's the how, which is natural selection, and that's where Darwin comes in, because he proposed the mechanism. So, okay, we have this idea of this grand tree of life and common ancestry, genealogical continuity. How does that happen without God? How does that happen without a designer? Because when we look at animals and we look at organisms, they're so complex, there's so much diversity. It doesn't seem like those can naturally just come into being. So given that they have the appearance of design, then there must be a designer. So atheists want to reject that idea. And Darwin came along and allegedly showed how it's possible to get design without, or seeming design without, a designer. And so that's the how of evolutionary theory, and the mechanism is supposed to be natural selection, which I can explain as well.
Yeah, so what I understood there was it's basically a model of trying to understand nature and the world, the physical world, and how it came to be. And from my understanding, it started off very simple, but somehow ended up being these complex organisms and forms of botany that we see around us. Is that one way to understand it?
Yeah, I mean, in the beginnings of evolutionary theory, there was this idea of progression from more simple to more complex. Nowadays, that kind of gloss is not used because in big part because when we look at the fossil record and the organisms that existed millions and even billions of years ago, they're not really less complex.
That's a good point.
And it's hard to define what complexity really is in purely materialistic terms. It's kind of evaluative to say, oh, this is more complex than that, without appealing to like some kind of metaphysical value-based judgment. So, but yeah, generally that's the case.
Right. Well, let's maybe rewind and go back to the beginning here. From my understanding and what I've learned, there's this idea of a primordial soup that existed on the earth. And there is a kind of new field called Abiogenesis, which is research concerned with the chemical processes behind the initial formation of the simplest forms of life. And obviously this could never be observed. People are trying to test it in labs. This is kind of what we're taught, right? Is there was this primordial soup, and somehow here you got the first forms of life, which eventually became, proteins. And as we know, proteins are responsible for a lot of what we would call organic matter. So, I mean, that's one of the things that's always confused me is how did this primordial soup even emerge something and then eventually emerge and evolve to such a point of, actual sea life and then eventually getting onto land and becoming everything that we know on land. That's always been really confusing or unclear to me. And again, my background isn't in biology, so I'm a layman when it comes to this, but maybe you can help clarify this idea of the primordial soup and how this model tries to explain how everything around us came to be.
Yeah, so the idea of abiogenesis, it's pretty much accepted at this point that there is no explanation that we have for how life can come from non-life. And it was always assumed that, oh, well, we'll find an explanation. Like, oh, it's, there are a lot of hand waving was going on by a lot of the popularizers of evolutionary theory throughout history is like, oh, don't worry your pretty little heads about that. I'm sure if you put enough chemicals within this goop, it's eventually going to interact and react, and you'll have all kinds of chemical reactions that will create a protein or a lipid. And so that was kind of assumed, but people have been asking more earnestly, okay, well, what is the explanation? And I think one thing that is really telling, there's a nano engineer and a synthetic chemist named James Tour, and he is a very prominent researcher. He was at Rice University. I don't know if he's still there, but he has over 500 research papers, over 100 patents. So he's really accomplished in the field of synthetic chemistry and nanoengineering. And so his whole concern is with, okay, well, how do we synthetically, man-made, create simple molecules? Like that's his whole research focus and life's work. And his point, and there's a video on this. You can see him lecture, and he makes this challenge. He says, if anyone can explain to me how natural selection and evolutionary biology can explain how these very simple building blocks of life that we know, such as nucleic acids, proteins, lipids, etc. If anyone can explain how these naturally came about, please tell me, and I'll give you a prize. Because so far, no one has been able to explain it, and I've talked to Nobel Prize-winning scientists, I've talked to colleagues, I've talked to people who are top of the field in evolutionary biology, and no one really knows. And I'm in a good position to judge any explanation that someone offers because I'm a synthetic chemist. So creating molecules is my business, it's my job. And so he has this paper actually that lays out exactly how incredibly mind-bogglingly improbable it is for the right things to happen at the right time in the right conditions for even the most simple acid or protein or lipid to generate, right?
But isn't the often the rebuttal to that is, well, given enough time, right? And this right cocktail, as you said, it's just a matter of statistical probability. I mean, we're talking billions of years here. There's a higher chance that something can happen if you give it a long stretch of time. I mean, what do you think about that? That's usually a rebuttal that I've heard.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty sloppy and uncompelling rebuttal because you're just appealing. People who say that are just appealing to big numbers, and everyone notoriously has time wrapping their heads around big numbers. Like, really, what is the difference between a billion and a trillion? What's the difference between a billion and a quadrillion?
A lot of
Obviously,
zeros.
we know that
different.
yeah, a lot of zeros, but like the actual scale of what that is, because if you get into quadrillion years, that's more than the age of the universe, or the estimated age of the universe. So when you actually calculate the probabilities,
right,
based on what a synthetic chemist is doing, right? Because he's in a good position to know how likely it is, and you can develop a probability distribution based on very controlled conditions, and he can still give you a probability, or he has a better sense of, okay, what are the numbers for this to happen completely randomly. And yeah, it's true. You have enough time, and it can happen. But if that time scale is a billion times more than the age of the universe, then so what? Like, it doesn't prove anything. And I mean, there's more to say about that actually, because if you think about, like, an analogy that people give is, well, if you have a junkyard, just a junkyard in the middle of nowhere, give it enough time, right? Billions of years, and eventually you can have a fully functional jumbo jet 747 commercial airliner come out of that mess, right? Just give it enough time. Right? That seems to make sense, right? But there's another layer to that, because if you look at a jumbo jet, even that, like, we would say that would take billions of years. But a jumbo jet, it's taken engineers, like the actual development of the 747 that Boeing produces, that development took around 10 years for them from the beginning to the end of developing that. And you had the best scientists, you had the best engineers working to develop this jet. But when you look at even the simplest cells and the simplest proteins, not even all of the greatest scientists have been able to produce anything like a cell. You have scientists with extreme difficulty trying to create even synthetic molecules, which are not even on the same order of magnitude as proteins and then cells. So you have even the best intellects trying to deliberately design something are not able to do it in highly controlled environments. But supposedly, something randomly happening is supposed to outdo and outsmart all of this collective intelligence that's working towards a goal. The 747, yeah, humans have been able to design and create that, and it took 10 years of deliberate design. And we're granting that it would take billions of years for that to randomly happen. So what about something that humans can't even generate, that can't even put together currently with all these resources? Because people have tried, right? There's a lot of incentive to try to do this, and no one has even come close. So that, I think, speaks more to the order of magnitude and the size of the numbers that we're talking about. whenever someone says, "Oh, just give it enough time, it'll happen," we should interrogate that and look a little bit closer because it's fuzzy math.
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly hear some people go, well, it's a matter of we still don't know. We haven't discovered it yet, but science will, one day show us how that
Inshallah,
works. I mean,
inshallah.
that's sometimes what we hear.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a lot
inshallah,
of faith.
be open to it. But right, it does require a lot of, I would certainly argue, imagination and faith, just like somebody believing in, God or other things that you can't directly prove yet, through empiricism, etc.
Yeah, I don't think that there is. I think there is evidence, and we talked about this on the other podcast. Empirical evidence of God, and
Yeah, I was speaking more from kind of the atheist lens, like that would usually be the response from people I've spoken to. But you know what came up for me though when you were discussing this, and those are really good, questions, right? Like how could we really accept something like that? The intellect just naturally thinks it's far-fetched. I mean, if you give it reflection. And this kind of brings up this other idea of this concept of fine-tuning in the universe, because there are physicists and scientists that say, well, if we accept that, there's all these coincidental and very lucky accidents, we're basically relying on a lot of luck when it comes to understanding all this stuff happening. And on the other end, I mean, isn't it also very plausible to suppose that these things were not accidents, but happened according to some design and plan, and there's some intelligent consciousness behind it?
well, when it comes to tuning of the universe, again, the probabilities are so ridiculous that they're mind-boggling, and for the different constants like the speed of light, the gravitational constant, the Planck's constant, all of these physical variables, for them to all be at the exact right amount for there to even be stars, or let alone planets, let alone water, let alone carbon, let alone life. Again, like the probabilities are so mind-boggling. So how, when human beings see these like very improbable things happening, it's just intuitive to think, well, this was intentional, and there has to be something else, a greater force that is designing and is generating this, creating this. That's just a very natural. That's the way the human mind works, right? And so the way that atheists and evolutionists want to dispute that is by saying, well, no, it's all random. You just have to have enough of a time scale, right? All of their arguments boil down to that. And this is also the response that they give for fine tuning. They say, well, yeah, it seems like it's all been perfectly designed, but that's because there's an infinite number of universes, and we just happen to be living in one that is conducive to life. Right, so this is the explanation they give. They appeal to this idea of the multiverse, and the multiverse is actually very popular because I went to Harvard for undergrad, and I had physics professors who would talk about this fine tuning, and they would admit, in class that this is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night. And why? They didn't say why, but it's okay. You've lived your life as an atheist and not believing in a higher power, not believing in God, thinking that it's irrational. But then you have all of these signs and all of this evidence that, okay, well, how can it be explained? So there was a state before this kind of multiverse idea of infinite number of universes besides our own. Before that came into vogue, there was a crisis, an existential crisis amongst a lot of physicists, and they might have admitted it during office hours or class time, but it wasn't like very publicized, right? You don't want to show a chink in the armor of atheism and naturalism. But anyway, long story short is that they proposed this infinite number of universes. Okay, well, what's the evidence? What's the empirical evidence for these universes outside, and outside in quotes and air quotes, because, okay, what does outside even mean? If you have the idea of the universe, what does outside of it mean? What is the empirical evidence for that? And of course, there's none, but it's just assumed like, okay, well, there's no other way to explain it, so we have to appeal to the multiverse. Well, no, there is another way to explain it. It's called theology. It's called God. It's called a higher power. And so and it's far more plausible. Or fine, we'll get best case scenario for the atheist. It's equally plausible. Okay, because if you want to say that, okay, this is something outside the universe, because as far as theology is concerned, God, even Islamically, God is not created. He is not part of the creation. So as far as if you want to be a strict empiricist and say, oh, okay, well, God is outside the universe, just like these other multiverses would be, these other universes would be, then as far as the atheist is concerned, probability distribution is equally plausible. So, I mean, that's where it is. They'll try to argue against that, but I don't see how they can escape that conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, I always felt like this idea of multiverse was just trying to explain away the probability of an intentional initiator for the universe, because obviously this idea of the universe having a beginning, which is very clear according to most physicists and astrophysicists, it's like, okay, well, what made the Big Bang go bang? And in order to solve that, it's like, oh, well, it was born out of some other universe. Okay, so you're still giving it a cause that we can't directly access, similar to God. I've also heard, when it comes to this primordial soup, some views are saying, well, maybe there's extraterrestrial higher intelligence that kind of planted us here. Okay, so you're still giving the reason or the cause to something of higher intelligence. You just don't want to give it to this concept of a divine. And it's like you still keep hitting the same wall. I feel like when you talk about these types of things. And I mean, from the Islamic perspective, we do believe in several universes, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created sab'a samawat, but that doesn't mean that these are this is what gave birth to what exists. I mean, you're still giving the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from a Muslim perspective to something in creation.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I haven't seen anyone be able to get around that wall. And this is not new. Like philosophers of the past recognize that there is this wall, and that's what became the basis for many of the arguments for God across religions. Even you have the Kalam argument. And then you have other thinkers that use different versions of it. You can argue that Descartes, for example, used a kind of version of that. You have Leibniz, German philosopher, who also seemed to have a version of that kinds of argument. But it all goes back to, there's very, very many paths to that same conclusion.
Right. And it's also interesting that, when it comes to everything in our existence, whether it's an iPhone or a water bottle, nobody would just accept that, oh, this kind of formed because for millions or billions of years, some junkyard put this iPhone together for us. And of course, the atheist might say, well, it's not quite like that, Karim. There is natural selection. There is this kind of force that's acting upon what exists. But then I ask, okay, in order for evolution to actually exist, it requires existence of something that can make copies of itself. Randomness can only be understood if it was contrary to some sense of organization, right? Am I wrong about that?
Right, yeah. It goes back to the discussion we just had on abiogenesis, right? Atheists are just pushing back the problem, right? They're saying, oh, well, there is an explanation, and they just push the problem back, but ultimately it leads to this question of, okay, well, how did life come from non-life at that molecular level? And they admit that it's a mystery. So you haven't really explained anything. You haven't really provided much of an explanation naturalistically for the origin of life, the origin of complexity of life, diversity of life, and so on and so forth.
Right. What would you say are some of the other big questions in evolutionary biology that other scientists have voiced?
There are a lot of questions I think some of the things that are most relevant are, understanding the fossil record and whether the fossil record supports gradual change over time or not. There are questions regarding why certain parts of the genetic code are have components that don't have anything to do with the organism itself, right? Like, so you have fish, as an example, like fish that have genes that are found in birds, and those genes are associated with growing, talons, for example, or beaks. So why does a fish have that? So, okay, well, maybe there's some common ancestor, but no, like that doesn't match the phylogenetic tree that we assume fish and birds to be on, or those families of the species. So there's all kinds of questions around that. That has given rise to entire subdisciplines within evolutionary biology. There's evolutionary development biology within the larger field that looks at, okay, well, maybe these common ancestors had pretty built out gene packages, and as they evolved, or as the organisms themselves moved to different parts of the world and different environments, or climate changed, then those different parts of the gene would be triggered. And so you have the same gene, but if you're on land, it creates legs instead of fins, or different parts of the gene of the genome are triggered based on the environment. And so this is called evolutionary development biology, but it speaks against natural selection, because the whole idea of natural selection is that the environment, all the genome does is mutate randomly. That's the random component. Most of those mutations are maladaptive, meaning they don't help the organism, but a small percentage are adaptive, meaning they're beneficial to the organism. And then so those organisms that have the adaptive genes, or the adaptive part of their genetic code, they're selected, and so they're able to pass on those genetics to their offspring, and so on. So it's the environment. It's not like those advanced aspects of the gene exist prior, and then they just need to be triggered, right? That goes completely against this idea of random mutation then being filtered or selected by the environment. It's a complete inversion of Darwinian natural selection. And there's that, and then there's also all kinds of discussion around epigenetics, which is that you can have two organisms which, when you look at the genetic level, their genomes are very similar, and they share a lot of the same genes and the same gene structures, but the phenotypes, meaning the actual organism itself, the two are very different, even though they have the same genotype. So how is that? Like, what is affecting? Because there's a very reductive view of organisms that, okay, well, you have the genes and you have the genome, and that's the blueprint of the organism. So if you have two organisms with the same DNA, the same genotype, then that means they're going to be the same organism. They're going to have the same phenotype, the physical characteristics. But that's not the case. You have very similar genotypes, shared genes, but very different phenotypes. And so it's not understood, like, what is affecting that? Because as far as the previous evolutionary biology was concerned, it was just, random mutations filtered by the environment, and then you have selection, positive selection for certain phenotypes. But so these are some of the questions that have really rocked the field of evolutionary biology. If you're on the outside, you don't really get a sense of that. You don't really get a sense of, okay, this is not established science. Whenever you have debates between like Christians and evolutionists, the one side always makes it seem like, oh, the science is solid. There's no question of how human beings evolved and how organisms evolved. It's just a matter of, finding details here and there. We haven't worked out all the details, but overall we have a solid understanding of how all of this works. But if you actually go behind the scenes, it's a very different picture. And you'd be surprised at the kinds of open questions that are being discussed. And it's even the entire idea, as I said, of whether natural selection is the main component of evolution. That's in question, right? Because it seems like epigenetics plays a much greater factor. It seems like there's other forces on the level of DNA and RNA that affect how genes create proteins and then form cells and form the organism. Those are all open questions, and it doesn't seem like natural selection, insofar as we think that natural selection is a coherent concept anyway, which I don't believe, and that's further discussion. But even if we do think that natural selection and Darwinism makes sense, at this point, evolutionary biologists are coming to a consensus that it's not even that big of a deal as far as how organisms develop and species are originated.
That's a pretty big deal. So my understanding is, okay, so natural selection is this, it's not necessarily, it doesn't have any foresight or conscious motives. It simply somehow favors certain beneficial genetic traits that already exist within a population, and it's somehow favored by the environmental, I don't know, interaction, if you will, or cues, and this is how these certain beneficial traits from mutations are more likely to survive and be passed on through breeding within that population. But I still am very confused as to how do you have something like DNA, which is called a code and an instruction for the building blocks of organisms? How did this even come to be? And how does it even know how to replicate? And also what I've learned was that these mutations happen at a very, very small percentage, or it's at kind of an impressive minimum, so to speak. But without those variations, we wouldn't get the diversification and branching out of certain populations. But again, I just keep hearing like, well, it sounds like there's a lot of design here, right? Even from the perspective of evolutionary biology. And I still get kind of confused of how do we accept all these things, but then, we also fall back on these ideas of, well, nothing about it is conscious, but yet there's some kind of favoring, through natural selection. Why is it that certain traits are identified by the species as more favorable or not, and may increase the likelihood of breeding with those organisms that have those things? I mean, I'm a little confused with all that, and I'm wondering if you can maybe simplify it for us, this idea of heredity, mutations, and copying of the genes. Because I just feel like there's something going on here besides, the luck of the draw or trial and error. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, if we go to the basic idea of natural selection, it's supposed to be very intuitive and logical, and that's why it's been so successful. But if you go into the details of it, that's where there's problems. And there have been different philosophers and also biologists who have been pointing some of these contradictions out. But we can, the very standard explanation or example that's given of a peppered moth, for example. So this is a moth that's in England, and prior to the Industrial Revolution, these moths were more light colored. They're more white and had, spots on them, black spots. And these moths lived in the forests. When the Industrial Revolution happened, you'd have more smog, there was more pollution, and this affected the coloring of the tree that where the moths lived, their habitat. And the trees became darker with smog. They used to be whiter, lighter in color and shade, and then they became darker. And then what was discovered is that, okay, well, these peppered moths, now when we look at the peppered moth population, most of them are darker, they're grayer. Instead of being a lighter white, they're grayer and darker. And so there's been this change in the phenotype and the characteristic of the moth's wings in their color. And it's because of this is natural selection in action. Why? Because now the moths, when the trees changed color due to pollution, the moths that were brightly colored were easily seen by predators like birds. And so birds came and ate those moths at a higher frequency, at a higher rate, and so they had less reproductive advantage in order to spread those genes responsible for a white or lighter colored wings. But those moths that, due to mutation, had darker wings that blended in and camouflaged with the trees better, predators had a hard time finding them, hunting them. So those moths were more reproductively successful and were able to pass the dark-colored, the genes responsible for dark-colored wings to their offspring. And so that phenotype proliferated in the population until the population as a whole became more dark in coloring. And so this sounds like a very logical explanation of, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, how can you dispute that, right? The problem is that you can point to anything within the environment as causing anything else. And what I mean by that is you have the same kind of explanation for, well, you have moths, right, that are camouflaging, but then what about certain bird species that are very brightly colored? And you have peacocks and you have toucans and parrots, and they're so brightly colored. Oh, well, that's also adaptive to be brightly colored because it helps you attract mates. And so you have two different evolutionary explanations for how, okay, one species developed more camouflage,
right,
and that changed, its coloring, and then you base it on, okay, hiding from predators, whereas this other species is brightly colored, so you have a convenient explanation for that as well. Oh, it's to find a better mate. So there's always going to be, for any change, you can always give an evolutionary explanation, and that's bad because it means that the theory is vacuous because it can explain everything. It doesn't matter, and therefore it's not predictive. Like, you don't know why it's really the case that these moths are a certain color or have certain structures or any other organism, because you can always have a just so story, right? And there's no way to go back and determine what it was actually that caused these changes. And so, for an analogy of that, so these are historical explanations, right? Because imagine, here's an example. Why did Donald Trump win the election, for example? This is a question, and there's so many different factors that conceivably could have affected that, but it's just a post hoc explanation. Like, that election has already happened, and so you can always, and there's thousands of different explanations. All kinds of political analysis has been done. Oh, it was because people were racist. Oh, it was because of the economy. Oh, it was because Hillary was so incompetent. There's all these causal explanations, or seemingly causal explanations, but they're just post hoc. After you know the outcome, after you know what has happened, it's very easy to concoct an explanation for why that's the case. And that's what all of natural selection, an explanation appealing to natural selection is. It's okay, we have the result. You have birds that are brightly colored. You have moths that are that camouflage. You have big animals. You have small animals. You have animals with sharp teeth. You have animals with great vision. You have all these different traits that organisms within the animal kingdom display and express, but you can attribute those to any number of the infinite number of environmental factors in which those organisms live now and in the past. So this is not science. Okay, this is not like, you're not predicting how moths will look like in 100 years or any other, or next year, right? Because it's dependent on all these factors. So it's a non-explanation and it's non-science. And this is a kind of argument that you can read by it's a book by Jerry Fodor. He's a philosopher and he's also an atheist, and he wrote a book called What Darwin Got Wrong. And it was a very controversial book. And he makes this argument, and he's an atheist. Mm-hmm. He's coming from a philosophy of science background, but he co-wrote it with a professor of biology. And their whole argument is that, look, there's something deeply wrong with this idea of natural selection. And we're atheists. We're not saying that, okay, this is evidence of God, or this is something that lends credibility to theism. But as scientists or as rational naturalists, we need to get our house in order. We need to really figure out what's going on, because this is not a good explanation. This is not science. And so if you're interested in reading this argument in depth, mm-hmm. I'd recommend that book. And it's very interesting.
Right. Yeah, for sure. So just to kind of summarize, so far we talked about, one of the big questions obviously is, how did the universe get here? But we're not going to dive into that too much today, but more so, how did living organisms get here on Earth and this primordial soup? And it's still a huge mystery, and there's still a lot of research that is taking place, and it's obviously something that can never directly be observed. We also have things like the fossil records and these other examples like the peppered moth and things that some scientists would argue are observable evolutionary processes. But let's say, all right, I don't know about natural selection or some of these mechanisms that have been defined, but how would you make sense of all the data and evidence that evolutionary biology does build off of, like the fossil records or these types of things which they claim supports the model?
Yeah, so undoubtedly there's a lot of data. There's a lot of scientific work that's been done. But all of the data is what I call local problem solving, in the sense that you have scientists focusing on one organism, one, trait, characteristic, behavior of a particular organism, and they've compiled a lot of data here and there, very locally, very contained. But the bigger questions and the bigger picture that is supposed to explain everything and make sense of it all, there's not much that's been done on that level. There's not much that's been proven on that level. We've already talked about abiogenesis, right? And what synthetic chemists think of this idea of life from non-life, and whether it's really something that we are able to conceptualize even, let alone prove. But even more fundamental questions like, well, not more fundamental questions, but equally fundamental questions like, well, why do we have sexes? Like, why are there two sexes, male and female, generally speaking? Like, why is that necessary? Like, what is the reproductive advantage that confers that kind of characteristic of organisms? Why do things have to reproduce sexually as opposed to asexually or non-sexually? These are questions that, again, you can speculate. There's plenty of speculation, but there's not really any established answer that makes sense or that's been proven in any way. You have all these kinds of issues on the global level when we're talking about the bigger picture, the bigger ideas, and the evidence is not there. You can show, in a lab, plenty of examples of how fruit flies can, grow different kinds of wings or not develop wings or be born without eyes or have like different kinds of anatomical structures. But there's not, those are all micro phenomenon, microevolution. Plenty of data on that. Plenty of scientists have been working on that for years, decades. But again, the bigger issues, there's more questions than answers by far. But again, the rhetoric and the actual discussion that happens in public between theists and atheists, evolutionists and creationists, is whenever evolutionists want to claim that, our stuff is solid and we know what we're talking about, we have all this evidence, all the examples are usually, they direct your attention to all these local examples and this local body of data. And so there's a lot of equivocation, right? So that people think, oh yeah, well, there is all this data, there is all this evidence, and not realize that behind the scenes, there's all this questioning and even crises within the discipline.
Okay, Daniel, I mean, I hear that. You make a lot of good points, but, there are Muslims that believe in Allah, they believe in His messenger, and they are like, hey, I don't have a problem with evolutionary biology. In fact, they would argue that if it's a model of science that seems to be pretty valid, at least as far as, how organisms came to be, why can't we just accept that maybe that's the way Allah decided to create it? There is this idea of gradualism in the universe. This is, I don't think any wise Muslim will say, the earth is only 7,000 years old or whatever. There's a lot of data to support how long, the earth has been here, how long the universe has been evolving, so to speak. I mean, can't Muslims still believe in aspects of evolutionary biology, if not the whole model, at least when it comes to how all species came to be? And we can maybe talk about the idea of human beings and the creation of Adam as well. But why would this be an issue for some Muslims to actually say, I believe in evolutionary biology? It makes a lot of sense to me. And I find the evidence to be compelling and not necessarily taking away from the qudra or the power or decision making of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I mean, Allah also creates and does what He wills and how He pleases when He wants. And why couldn't this just be understood as a process like that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So far we've just been talking about how compelling evolutionary biology is on its own terms outside of the theological questions and the specific questions with Islam. But if we look at whether evolutionary biology can be reconciled with Islam, there's problems. There's points of irreconcilable conflict. And it's very clear, and I can mention there's two main problems. One is this idea of human origin, right? Because Islamically, we know that Adam alayhi salam did not have parents, right? He did not have a biological birth. And that's, as far as all the tafsir are concerned, that's solid knowledge, right? And that's how everyone has understood, the story of Adam in the Quran and in Hadith, is that he did not have a biological birth. Just like Isa, Jesus Christ, did not have father. Adam did not have a father or a mother, right? So this is big problem as far as evolutionary biology is concerned, because all life is from life, right? That's the basic naturalistic assumption. You can't have spontaneous generation. You can't have something just coming out of nothing, much less a advanced, quote unquote advanced organism like a human being or even, a multi-celled organism. So that's one area of direct, irreconcilable conflict. You can't believe in the story of Adam, ISM, and also accept the naturalistic perspective on life and the origin of species. Now, people might say that, so Muslims might say, well, why don't we look at it as a miracle, right? Maybe evolutionary biology, natural selection, everything else that scientists are discussing, maybe that's the standard for life normally, and how things originate and evolve. And humans are just special. Adam was a miracle, and he was just created as a special creation as opposed to other things like chimpanzees or whatever else. The problem with this, however, is that it conflicts with another well-established point of evolutionary biology, called polygenism.
What's that?
Okay, polygenism. Yeah, so it's not like polygamy.
Okay.
But it's polygenism is this idea that the earliest human population, from which all humans come from, like descended from, had multiple, had several thousand members. So basically, humans couldn't have descended from a single man and woman, right? And what this means and how this is determined is that you have geneticists looking at the human genome, and not only the human genome, but looking at actual genetic profiles of different human beings across the world. And based on the differences between those different genetic profiles, they can project back in time to say, okay, this is what the population of human beings was at this time, 100,000 years ago, 500,000, 2 million years ago. They can project that, and we can talk about their methods, because there's a lot of juicy stuff there. But based on that, there's no way that the human population, based on the genetic code that we see, could have originated from just an Adam and Eve. Right, so that's another direct conflict, and that conflict also, cuts to this idea of, okay, the miraculous origin of Adam, ISM, and you would have to say that, not only the origin and creation of Adam and Eve and Hawa were miraculous, but also the way that their genetics was also miraculously in a way that would lead to the conclusion that, okay, what scientists are seeing today of there being an initial human population of several thousand members.
Polygenism. So does this imply that this kind of notion of one day this set of Homo sapiens, branched out uniquely, and then from there came all the humans? This kind of denies this and says no, there were probably branches and pockets of populations that were kind of arising all over the place. Is that right, or?
Not necessarily all over the place. It's not parallel evolution. It's just, okay, you have this new species that's arising because of mutations and epigenetics and other forces that are causing this new species called Homo sapien. But it's not just like one couple, a male and a female. It's happening to several thousand members. Like there's an entire population, the first human beings, and they're all in the same geographical location. And then you have you have Neanderthals who also have evolved or branched off from the common ancestor again. And they might have, these two species might have mated, and so there's all kinds of explanations for trying to interpret the genetics that people have today across the world, as well as explaining the fossil record, because you have to have those two things match, and that causes all kinds of problems because sometimes they don't match. And I already mentioned like some of the problems with phylogenetics and trying to match the evolutionary tree to the actual genes of a specific organism. So it
Right.
becomes a very complicated matching game. But as far as we're concerned, it's all speculation at this point because it's constantly changing. Like the
Right.
history of the human population is constantly changing based on new fossils that are found, as well as new developments in genetics.
Subhanallah.
Yeah, and so pretty much on a weekly basis, you can guarantee that there's going to be some new discovery that's going to challenge the timeline for human development. Literally, like if you go into Google right now and look up, groundbreaking discovery and evolutionary human history, pretty much like clockwork, you'll find all of these new discoveries coming out on a regular basis. And what that tells us is that that's how little the field is actually developed. Because if you have an established field of knowledge, like in physics, there's not a groundbreaking discovery every century, right? Or maybe every decade. You can hardly find a big discovery that changes physics as we know it, or chemistry as we know it. But when it comes to evolutionary biology, every week, there's a new, groundbreaking discovery, and that tells us that it's not like the field itself is not very complete, because there's only so much information that's available, but it's made to seem like, oh yeah, we have such a solid understanding of these phenomenon and this history, but it's all propaganda as far as I can tell.
I see. So it is difficult to claim solid validity when the field itself is always changing and causing deeper questions and even awakening to certain things we're still ignorant about.
Yeah, of course.
Now, so let me try to kind of frame this. So it sounds like there's almost like three possibilities for, the believing Muslim. The first possibility is I accept evolutionary biology as it is, dictated in science because it's just rational to me. It makes sense. But I believe that Adam was created specially by God and inserted on the earth at some point. A second position could be I believe in evolutionary biology as science dictates, and I also believe that Adam evolved just like other species, and at some point Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blew the soul into this creature, and this is what is also known as ensoulment. And then there's the third position of, what you might call creationism, which is that, I don't buy evolutionary biology. I accept, everything in the Quran and Sunnah as literal, and I don't even investigate evolutionary biology and think that it has anything to offer, because this is a matter of theology, not science, and science can't prove theology, and theology can't necessarily prove science. So I'm just going to keep them separate, and I'm just going to accept the creation narrative as it is. Even though that makes a lot of sense for people too, unto itself. But it sounds like maybe those are the three possibilities that a Muslim could take today. Am I missing another option, or would you say those are three likely positions to have today?
Yeah, those are, I think, the three main positions. If you think, well, do you say three or four? So you can, the one position that you said where the ensoulment view, right? That humans evolved exactly as evolutionary biology describes, but God selected one individual or two individuals to blow into them their souls, and they became the first human beings. That, I think, is contrary to Islamic evidence and agreed upon position, in that Adam alayhi salam did not have a biological birth. He did not have parents, right? So that's a physical thing. being born
Right.
and having parents. So that physical fact
Right.
that Islam claims happened, that you have the first human being not being born biologically, there's a contradiction there, right? So you would have to stray from the consensus view and the established position in Islam that Adam was not born.
If I may add, it's irreconcilable because, like you said, there's just a lot of evidence in the Islamic tradition. For instance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says he created Adam from his own two hands, right? This is a very unique status or honor. You have the idea, as you said, where, Maryam, peace be upon her, when Gabriel came to her and said, "You will have a son," she said, "How can I have a son when no man has touched me?" She obviously recognizes that to procreate you need a man present, and Allah said, if I want this to be, it will be, and it happens. Same thing with Adam alayhi salam. You have numerous hadiths where Adam is referred to by the Prophet ﷺ and Musa alayhi salam as the father of human beings, right? For instance, the hadith of the day of resurrection. People will go to Adam and say, "You're the father of all of us. You're the one who Allah gave paradise to. Intercede." So there's clear evidence in the literature that Adam alayhi salam was unique and his status was like no other because he was not born of any parents. This is very difficult to argue against, you're saying, and that's why the ensoulment position, from a theological perspective, is highly unlikely, if not false.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can definitely get into all of the ayat and the hadith that establish this. I'm glad that you mentioned all of those points, and there's many others as well. But there's also inconsistency with the idea itself, because the idea of why would even someone resort to this kind of explanation for the origins of human beings? Like, okay, everything develops naturalistically, just as evolution describes, and then there's just one point where God ensouls one organism who becomes Adam, right? Why would you even appeal to that? Because as far as naturalism is concerned, it's not just the human body, like the physical body, that has originated naturalistically through evolution, but also the human mind, and also language and thought and all of the things
consciousness,
all the things that make us human. That's also they claim has a naturalistic explanation. So ultimately, you're still violating naturalism by appealing to this concept of ensoulment. So if you're willing to violate naturalism in that instance, why don't you just violate naturalism entirely and say that, okay, well, Adam himself did not have any biological antecedents? I think there's a logical problem, inconsistency with the ensoulment view in itself.
What about the second possible position, which is, I believe God created he created natural selection and evolution as a divine quote unquote force to make everything evolve the way it did, but then he created Adam alayhi salam separately and uniquely in paradise, and then Adam descended here, and that's how we started. Why would that be a problem, or can that also be more of a middle way? Why or why not?
Yeah, because as we discussed, like the science itself has a lot of holes, has a lot of problems, has a lot of contradictions. Like the first half of our conversation was just about all of those problems. So I don't understand why, I guess I do understand why. It's just that Muslims have so much faith in evolutionary biology and the scientific process as a whole and scientific consensus as a whole. And what I've tried to get across in this talk and also in many of my writings is that that's misplaced faith and confidence. And if you actually look at the discussions that even non-Muslims, non-theists are having, they're bringing up all these questions and challenging natural selection and evolutionary biology at this fundamental level. So why should Muslims have this confidence in this process that's being refuted and critiqued as we speak? Like it doesn't speak very highly of collective Muslim intelligence, that our approach to this subject is so predicated on having faith in something that others have had no problems or trouble intelligently, rationally critiquing. Like, are we that anti-intellectual? Are we
Right.
that anti-rational that we just accept whatever the most, because as far as public discourse is concerned, you have the rational side and you have the irrational or even anti-rational side. Like, that's the stereotype of the Bible thumping creationist. And so we can't buy into that dichotomy, right? In truth, you have many Christian thinkers, philosophers, scientists, biologists, who have provided critiques, and just like you have atheists who have provided those critiques, and they're very compelling. They're not obviously irrational or anti-rational at all. So we don't Muslims
Right.
just I feel oftentimes when I have these discussions with otherwise very intelligent people, have this kind of knee jerk that they don't want to fall on the wrong side, and throw their hat in with the irrational Bible thumpers. No, we're Muslims. We're we discovered science, and we have 1,001 inventions, and we're very pro science, and they go out of their way to kind of show how committed they are to this idea of science, even though they themselves might have a degree in like something that's not scientific at all, but there's still this kind of allegiance to science that's very misplaced and very anti-intellectual.
Yeah, and being committed to science was something that Islamic civilizations exemplified. And being committed to science is not the same thing as I'm committed to certain models of science, which may not be very valid or rational. I mean, you can still be scientific and not accept the dominant ideology on a certain thing in science, right? And one of my professors in grad school, he said, science in reality can't prove anything. All it can do is provide compelling evidence for a particular position about reality, but that can also change, as we know, from Newtonian world of physics to Einstein and beyond. I mean, I think it's part of that humility that you find amongst believing or non-believing scientists. Some scientists really recognize, like, we have to be humble here and keep asking the questions and doing the research, and we shouldn't crystallize something unless, like you said, there just hasn't been any major discoveries, right, to indicate otherwise. Now, this kind of moves to the third position, though, right? This idea of creationism, and I don't like that word. And I don't mean creationism in the sense of like, these ignorant Muslims who are like, oh, the world is flat, because Allah says in the Quran, we spread the world flat. I've actually met Muslims who believe that in the past.
Flat
they're
Earth
like,
Muslims. Wow.
Yeah, it's
Kyrie Irving, the basketball player for the Cleveland Cavaliers.
He said that?
Yeah, I don't know if he was trolling, but this past season, like, he was interviewed and he was like, yeah, I believe in a flat earth. And it became this running joke that Kyrie Irving, this famous basketball player in the NBA, thinks that the earth is flat, but he's constantly flying around the world for playing basketball.
No, it's hilarious. I mean, when I was young, I used to attend this like halaqah with certain group of teachers and Muslims, and they had some views that I would consider to be imbalanced, to say the least, and unhealthy. This was, and so I remember attending these halaqas, and I have a lot of stories about it, a lot of trauma. But what was funny is, I may have mentioned this before. My father, he's a PhD in physics, mashallah, and he was a professor in physics and mathematics, and so he knows his stuff when it comes to hard science. And so one day I went home and I was like, Dad, today they taught us that the earth is flat. And he's like, you're never going back to those halaqas again. So yeah, I mean, so it's not about that. Like, when I say creationism, I don't mean this type of ignorance which is devoid of any scientific inquiry or evidence, but let's say more this idea of intelligent design or a divine cause, a consciousness behind the universe. This is, I think, a better way to frame it. So can you tell us more about that and what your thoughts are about this position and what it would look like, accepting that, Allah created everything the way He wanted, including Adam's unique creation, including, the way the world became what it is today with all the organisms and so on and so forth. As Allah tells us in the Quran, He created all kinds of creatures and even describes details about them, like they all came from water. Some fly, some have 2 legs, some have 4, some do this, do that. I mean, there's some interesting details in the Quran about the nature of creatures and organisms. So how would we frame this third position of intelligent design from a Islamic theological perspective, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not opposed to the word creationism. I don't think it's a bad word. Like, as far as creation, Allah created the universe. He created everything in it. I think that there are people associated or groups associated with creationism, but again, like, it's a broad term, so I'm not allergic to that term per se. But that aside, like, I don't think it's very hard, like, to see the world and understand the world very plainly based on what the Quran and Sunnah Hadith describe. I think that, if you are a Muslim, and we already had this discussion about how being a Muslim can be rationally justified and so on and so forth in our previous discussion on your podcast. But if you are a Muslim, then you should take the words of Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam as description of reality, right? This is what reality is, and you should have more confidence in that as a description of reality than speculation, even within science, even within whatever discipline. And there are many reasons that you can bring for that, and you can actually get very deep with it. But just on the surface level, well, look, science is constantly in flux. It's changing. Even within physics, the hard sciences, quote unquote, you have major changes between Newtonian physics, Einsteinian relativity, now string theory, quantum loop gravity. It's very speculative in the grand scheme of things at that higher epistemological level. And so as a Muslim, I feel very confident and comfortable reading what Allah has said, what my Creator and the Master of the universe has said. This is the way it is, right? This is the way the world is. And of course, it's, if I want to know how to, turn on my laptop or, do something technical and those kinds of details, yeah, I mean, those are technical disciplines and fields that deal with those minutiae, but the bigger picture and the bigger understanding of what the world is, what it's about, where it came from, where it's going, what's going to happen to it, what's going to happen to us, I'm very confident and comfortable, alhamdulillah, being able to read what my Lord and Master has said about that. And so I think that's the posture and the orientation that Muslims should have. Generally, you should have much more confidence in these very plain descriptions, and you mentioned hadith and ayat, and I don't think it should be a source of any kind of crises of faith or conflict.
If anything, it should be a foundation for self-generating approach to science,
exactly,
like we've seen in the Islamic civilization. Muslims never had a problem with scientific inquiry and finding evidence for physical processes in the world, understanding the relationship between cause and effects. I mean,
yeah, I agree with you. We have to have this paradigm. We have to have our first principles and really take them seriously and understand them on their own terms, instead of being like, okay, well, this is what science says, this is what John Q. Scientist has established, according to his methods, so that's what's real, and then let's interpret, let's see if the Quran matches that. If not, well, it must be a metaphor, and let's just interpret it that way to solve that, to reconcile that. No, I don't think that should be. That's not. It's not a compelling approach. It's not an epistemologically sound approach, or not a sound methodology. Or it should be the other way around. Just like you described, we're firmly established in our worldview, and in our and what Allah has said about what the world is. Okay, and then we can evaluate different sciences and direct our investigations accordingly. I think that's much more consistent.
So what I'm hearing you say is you're concerned with this idea of, okay, let's take what's already out there and somehow Islamify it or Islam and make a process of Islamization towards whatever current science there is. I mean, that is useful from time to time, but you're also saying, no, we should also have this intention or aspiration to build paradigms and models of understanding reality and all the sciences from these first principles of our deen. There's actually nothing wrong with that, and in fact, it would probably be a lot more cohesive and harmonious with the theological tenets that believers currently accept if they identify with their beliefs.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think that it definitely adds to harmony and a consistent worldview as opposed to a kind of fractured view that many Muslims have today, where there is science and science's description of reality, and then there's a Islamic view of reality, and really we don't bother to even see if they're reconcilable because they're completely different domains, and then so we can avoid all of those problems altogether. And there's sophisticated ways to say that, we have the seen realm, and that's where science is important. And then you have the unseen realm, the ghaib, which is just purely the Quran and Sunnah are concerned with, and we don't need to worry about reconciling the two, and we can live as modern people in the world and not bother ourselves thinking about these issues. But that doesn't work, right? That fractured ontology doesn't work because you have the Quran and the Sunnah talking about physical things and historical things that happened physically in the seen world. And there are many aspects, there are many things that are mentioned in the Quran that they're not technically ghaib, or even if they're of the ghaib, they still interact and can be perceived. They can be experienced. The fact that the sea was parted for Musa alayhi salam, for Moses, right? That's something that happened in the physical world. So there should be, if we were there around that time, we would see evidence of that happening physically, right? It would have an impact on the physical world. And actually, you do have Islamic thinkers and scholars of the past who would go and search for signs of the parting of the sea, for example, or would look for
Noah's Ark.
Yeah, exactly, like the Safina of Nuh alayhi salam. They would actually, of course, Allah is describing things that have happened historically and they had an effect. So let's go find those out. But if you have this kind of fractured ontology, this is what we read about in the Quran, that's like, personal belief. It has nothing to do with what's really real, which is science. Yeah, that's not very compelling, and it's, I think, incomplete faith if that's how you view the world.
Mm-hmm. Right, because it's tough to say, at least from my perspective, like, let science do science and let theology do theology, and I can just separate the two in my head, because then what happens is sometimes your theological beliefs or religious understanding becomes more allegorical, more archetypal, more symbolic. Like, does it matter if Adam was created in heaven and came down, or he evolved, from a branch of other populations or not? In the end of the day, the story's still true, and we still have to, be aware
there's still
of this.
Spiritual benefit, yeah. But it's all metaphorical.
That's a possible outcome, right? Of being like, these two, I can just separate them and honor them as their own system. But you're saying, well, it's not that simple, because number one, science does not deal with the unseen, and it probably never will, because it's built on empiricism, right? Only that which we can access and test and so on and so forth. And so there's always going to be this huge dimension that is not considered in any of these methodologies of science. right? But then on the other hand, it's like, well, you can't also measure metaphysics, right, or understand those things unless you hang out with a certain types of Muslims out there. You may have a different story. How do you reconcile this as someone who is firm in his iman of Islam, as well as you study science, you're into science and philosophy? I mean, how do you reconcile this? What would you say is the position? Going back to the three options I gave as possible perspectives and positions, what would be your kind of summary of all of this to help people understand the coherence of, honoring science as well as honoring Islam at once?
Well, I'm not really worried about honoring science, to be frank. I've studied enough science and studied enough philosophy of science and history of science, where my view is the emperor doesn't really have much clothes on. But I mean, I know Muslims. Well, some Muslims will find that scandalous, but
they'll be turned off.
Yeah, they'll be turned off by it.
That.
But whatever. We can talk about that. I mean, that's a bigger discussion. But I mean, I also don't discount the value of science in producing technology or medicine or things like that. But it's it's much smaller in scope. Yeah, science and technology. Science helps us do things very practically, pragmatically. But is it something that can really tell us, answer some of these deeper questions about God, about meaning, and about our position as human beings, and even historically, like what has happened historically? Can science really access that? The past, right, is by definition not accessible to our senses, right? We have memories, but that's not our senses, right? So I think that science is very limited in scope, but if we put it on this pedestal, which naturalism does, as an alternative to religion and as an alternative to that understanding of the world, then that's what causes confusions, and I don't think it's justified. So yeah, science, keep it in its place, right? And it's not this amazing, grand system of figuring out the way the world works and advancing human knowledge and progress of human civilization and all of these, this narrative that is very popular in the West in the past 200 years. It's bogus. So I don't think Muslims should buy into that. Unfortunately, there's been a very deliberate program to get us to buy into this narrative, because it means that Western civilization is superior and in a position of might and strength, because the West has been scientific and has discovered the scientific method, at least when it comes to modern technology. So Muslims need to catch up, right? This is what Muslims at the turn of the 19th century were concerned with, is we're being colonized. How are we getting our butts whooped, right? How can we catch up? It must be because we don't have science. Science is the key, and so that you have madrasas being abolished, ulama being defunded, and instead these other institutions being developed that not really generating any science, more like just teaching and indoctrinating materialism and secularism and so forth. But that was the underlying belief, is that if we want to advance as a civilization, we're behind because we don't have science. In reality, this whole question of why the Muslim world fell behind, very obvious. The Muslim world didn't have access to North and South America and enslaving two whole continents and taking all of their natural resources by force. That's why Europe was able to advance and get so far ahead of the Muslim world civilizationally. It was just it's a very clear anthropological answer to that. You have more resources. It's not some secret formula that that Europeans discovered that Muslims didn't have. Muslims didn't think, we need to investigate the world. No, that's historically not the case.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's also some evidence to suggest Muslims were crossing to the Americas before the Europeans as well. I mean, Columbus had Arabs on his vessel with compasses, from what I learned in university, in a course called the History of Latin America. That was, in UMass Boston. But I want to challenge you though, because some people go, well, I've read about the Ottoman Empire, and we know, for example, they, got a little arrogant in their height, if you will, and said, oh, we don't need any more inventions or innovations like the printing press and gunpowder, and how Napoleon, when he landed in Egypt, he wiped out the Mamluks because they were still fighting with swords and he had cannons. So I mean, science does play a role, and technology does play a role in advancement too. And sometimes our theological beliefs can hold us back in some circumstances. I mean, that's also evident. No?
No, I don't. I don't buy that. No, I don't buy that. I think that's just a convenient explanation used by secularists, naturalists to kind of justify and self-aggrandize themselves epistemologically. That's not the case. Like, there's two factors, or there's two possible stories here.
Okay.
The advancement, the technological superiority, that could be because something, the secret formula, namely the scientific method, was discovered by the minds of the Europeans. The enlightened minds, post-enlightenment Europeans, discovered the scientific method, and that catapulted them to the heights of technological advancement that they continue to enjoy to this day vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Okay, that's one narrative. Other narrative is, okay, you can get advanced technology, you can get power and the ability to impose your might violently through material means. Like, if you have more resources, if you have more money, if you have more human power, then you can achieve that. And so you have a very small continent taking advantage and having access to two entire continents, North and South America, of human power and material power. And if you, with the right historical conditions, that can lead to this kind of advancement without there being like some kind of underlying secret that has caused that. I find that compelling. I find that narrative far more accurate and compelling, and partly because the scientific method, the so-called the scientific method, there is no such thing. Like, there's no one method that all scientists use. There's not one methodology that you find across scientific disciplines, and even within scientific subdisciplines. Theoretical physicists in material science versus theoretical physicists in quantum physics, they have very different methods. Like, there's not much that is the same between those two subdisciplines of theoretical physics, let alone between physics and chemistry and biology and psychology or what have you. So this idea of a scientific method that was discovered, like, that is, that's just myth making. And if the scientific method is just if the scientific method is just like, oh yeah, we have hypotheses and then we observe the world and we modify our hypotheses, like, if that's the scientific method, then everyone has been doing that. Like, that's not that sophisticated or complicated of an idea that it had to be discovered by 16th and 17th century post-Enlightenment Europeans.
If I was going to reduce your argument to what I understand to be the essence, I'm going to take a stab at it. Are you saying that basically it's greed and oppression and muscle that help the Europeans advance, and not necessarily a superior understanding of reality, technology, and scientific progress?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, there was a lot of human suffering. And even, like, it could have been possible, like, even if we take out the human suffering component, like, I don't have to make a moralistic argument. It's just a fact that you have more access to material and human power, and it will result in what we saw historically. Obviously, there was a ton of human oppression and injustice, brutal violence and death and destruction, wiping out the Native Americans. Yeah, that all occurred as well, but that's not necessary to the larger point.
Well, I've also heard the position of, part of the collective trauma that struck the Muslim world was, of course, the invasion of the Mongols, right? Where
Right.
they just, pretty much, swooped throughout Asia and, of course, established themselves in China and Southeast Asia. And then they went to Baghdad, where it was the center of the Muslim world for hundreds of years. And estimates of approximately 2 million people were killed, libraries were destroyed, and you know how the story goes, right? Like
Right.
and so this also caused the shock, and I think many Muslims responded with, "Oh no, this is a punishment from God because of our heavy investment in the dunya and science and all of these things and the arts." And then that kind of resulted in people becoming, more, I don't know, ascetic or more orthodox in the religiosity. And that's sometimes one way historians say, like, why Muslims became stagnant, because this was a ripple effect. And of course there's colonization afterwards and all these things, but that was one of the big breaking points for the Islamic civilization. I mean, that's when it took a huge hit, besides of course the Crusades as well, which was over 150 years of waves of invasions coming down too. So I mean, there's a lot of things going on historically. I don't know if many people would agree with some of the points you made, but I'd love to hear your response.
Yeah, I'd agree. I was with you up until you said, like, oh, there was increased religiosity and asceticism, and that caused like us to take a step back as as Muslim civilization. Like, why does it always have to go to that? Like, why are historians, Western historians, so keen to associate being religious with being backwards and technological, anti-progress? So
That's a good
it
point.
always comes up in all of these explanations. So I have to like chuckle when it does, because it's not necessary. Like and the Mongol invasion is explanatory enough. Like, that kind of death and destruction is explanatory enough, like, to explain how it can negatively impact the ability to advance certain technologies. We don't need to like tack on like, oh, and then the Muslims also felt like they need to be like more ascetic and not pursue the dunya. And I don't know. I don't buy that.
I don't necessarily buy it either. I'm just saying this is a position I've sometimes heard. Right? You're saying no, that's not necessarily the only response or outcome to experiencing some invasions or other nations having more military might or resources. It's not always the response to just go, okay, let's just reclude into religiosity and matters of the unseen and just not deal with the dunya because the dunya is cursed anyways. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, let me like clarify. Like, I don't disagree with the idea that Muslims had reached a point of decadence at that time in history, and a punishment from Allah was that you had the Mongol invasion. Like, that idea in itself is not problematic as far as I'm concerned. And in the Quran, we know of many civilizations that Allah has told us about historically that reached this point of extravagance and decadence and immorality that they were then hit with disaster and calamity and being wiped out, essentially. So that I have no like issue with that idea. My issue was like that as an explanation for this larger question, or not larger, but this separate question of, well, why did Europe reach this point of technological advancement that the Muslim world didn't? I just don't feel like adding this component of, oh, it was because they became more concerned with God, or they became more religious, or they became more religiously conservative, or whatever else, like kind of explanations that are put forth. I don't think that's compelling or necessary, if that makes sense.
No, I think that's clarified.
Oh yeah, one other point that I want to bring up is just for Muslims who are struggling like with this idea, because I mean, I've been reading about this stuff and thinking about it for over a decade, and so I've come to like certain conclusions and like a certain perspective. And someone who hasn't gone through that might be listening to this and think, okay, yeah, so what? You're crazy, or I don't like how
you're anti-science.
Yeah, you're
you're what's it called? Conspiracy theorist and all this stuff.
Wow, Kareem, those labels came, flowing out of you. Is is this what you think?
My job is to try to understand people and different
Right.
perspectives, and I can certainly see how some people would go, well, okay, so so what exactly is your position? It's still a little ambiguous. Is it all just, oh, the Muslims are always, good and great and dandy, and we're just victims of horrible propaganda and unfortunate oppression? I mean, clarify for us. So what would you like to add as far as
Wait, what was ambiguous? I don't understand. What was ambiguous? Like Allah created the entirety of the universe as He describes it. He created human beings. Our father Adam alayhi salam, and his spouse from his rib. They were in Jannah. Iblis, the Malaika were told to prostrate to Adam. Iblis refused. So yeah, we have all those details, right? And so
sure. No, but I'm talking specifically about explained away the importance or weightiness of modern science. At least that's how it sounded, and that's why I think it's a little ambiguous. It's like, okay, so how should we see science? Is it fine? Is it science isn't something that is absolute? It's not theology. It's obviously not going to give us all the answers. But could you also, some people might go, well, that's the same thing about religion at large. It can't give you all the answers. There's a lot of answers, but there's still things that are mystery. Because some people might see it as you're just a reductionist of science, or you don't think science. Sure, it shouldn't be on this pedestal, as you explained, but then, okay, so then where should it be in our everyday lives, in our theological understanding, in our approach to ourselves, existence? You did say, yeah, it's important when it comes to medicine, when certain technological advancements, right? But there's a lot of stuff there that you don't feel is reliable when it comes to the scientific worldview as it's framed today. Did I understand that correctly?
yeah, well, we talked about it, right? We talked about the origins of life and humanity and species. Like, it's not like I'm just antagonistic toward science because I'm a literalist, fundamentalist. No, like my critiques and opinion of science are based on just investigating and thinking about and reading about and researching science itself. And does it cut mustard? Like, does it live up to the hype? And through my study, the answer is no. Like some of these grander narratives of science, definitely not. If we go into the specifics of evolutionary biology, definitely not. And there's all this other many other people saying the same thing. So I don't really understand like what's the ambiguity with my view. So as far as like, okay, science, my problem is not like, oh, science can't understand everything, therefore science is not reliable. No, that's not my position at all. Like there's all kinds of independent reasons. We were just focused on evolutionary biology, but and even there we just scratched the surface in terms of all the critiques that are available. And if people are interested, like I recommend, my writing. I mentioned one book, but if you go to my website, muslimskeptic.com, I have a reading list. There's a lot of material there, essays that I've written where I go into depth on some of these claims that I'm making, and there's too much to get across in the podcast. But I'm continuing to write a lot on these questions because I think they're of high importance to Muslims, because we're at this stage where we need to understand, okay, where does our faith intersect and interplay with this other major source of knowledge, purported source of knowledge, which is science. And okay, Islam is a source of knowledge, Quran and Sunnah is a source of knowledge, and then you have science. Okay, well, what is the interaction there, interplay there? And I don't think I haven't come across many Muslim intellectuals and writers of modern times who have provided much compelling perspectives on this. Frankly, there's a lot of deference by Muslims to science, and that, as I described earlier, I think that's misplaced. So I think there's a need for Muslim intellectuals and philosophers to take a more critical approach, more skeptical approach to science, and study the philosophy of science, study the history of science, ask these questions, and let's develop, our response and our reaction. And there's a deconstruction aspect to that, or a critical component, a negative component of that. And we wouldn't be alone, because there's all kinds of people of all backgrounds doing the same thing in different parts of the world, different disciplines. But there's also a positive and constructive aspect of it as well, because if you're able to put science in its rightful place and delimit it correctly and accurately, then that opens up your ability to see so much in creation in the world that science hasn't been able to explain, and is not even close to explaining. And it can provide great boost in iman, great boost in your conviction and yaqeen in Islam. You start reading the Quran, and not thinking, oh, well, because sometimes people will read the Quran, and I experienced this too, when I was younger, before I had gone through this path. You read the Quran and you read a verse, and it's like, okay, should I understand this literally or metaphorically? And part of the problem is, not having a solid basis in Arabic, which, most Muslims today don't have. But it's also like, even those who do have a solid basis in Arabic, okay, well, we have all this science that says something different. So I guess this is like just a question mark. At best, it's just a question mark. At worst, this is all just, metaphorical. And you referred to this earlier, but that has a big impact on your faith, because, okay, is your reality, is your understanding of what is real predicated and based on that bedrock of Quranic understanding of the world,
right,
or not? Right? It makes a big difference for a person's iman. So this is why this is such an important question. And then the other point, like as a final point, if there's no other questions, is that people have a hard time reconciling. Okay, well, how can we see a human being being generated from nothing? Like, that just seems so unscientific. That seems like so contrary to reason, that you could have a human being, Adam alayhi salam, just not be born biologically. All life should come from life, right? And then to respond to that and to give some perspective on that, consider that science, modern science, believes that the universe in its entirety came from nothing, right? And was just created, came through a big bang, right? So if science accepts that and believes that with a straight face, then how is it hard to understand that a human being, which is much less of a creation, is much less of a entity or being than all of the entire universe, how is it hard to believe that could be created by Allah, in whatever way that He sees fit? I just don't see the intellectual tension there. And when Allah says in the Quran, "Antum ashaddu khalqan am as-sama' banaha," right? Are you a greater creation? Are you more difficult to create, or the sky? He created it, right? And so this is, I think, puts into perspective the question of human origins in light of the origin of all of creation. So that's one thing that I would just say to help Muslims struggling with this.
No, I think you did a good job of clarifying. Again, I just want to make sure, your position is clearly understood, because I think you have a lot to offer. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it's like consistent. If I believe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created all of the universe from nothing, why couldn't He create Adam alayhi salam from his own two hands in the way that He described? It's not far-fetched. And it kind of reminded me of the beautiful example of Abu Bakr As-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, when Quraysh came to him after the Prophet ﷺ had the Isra al-Mi'raj, and they're like, hey, do you hear what your buddy's saying now? That he traveled, through the universes and went to Jerusalem and one night and came back. I mean, come on, like, are you really buying this? And Abu Bakr As-Siddiq is exemplifying exactly what you're talking about. He said, well, I believe in something greater than that. I believe he receives revelation from seven heavens, from the creator of the universe. So why wouldn't I be able to accept that he got on a buraq and traveled with Jibreel to the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is also confirmed in Surah An-Najm, by the way, and then went to Jerusalem and so on and so forth. So, I kind of almost see this as spiritual logic or religious logic, if you will. Like, yeah, of course, if you accept this, then you can accept that.
Yeah, it's logic. It's logic at its core. I mean, just reflect on the depth of wisdom and logic and rationality and also conviction, right? That Abu Bakr radiallahu anh demonstrated and expressed in this, because when you think, I think this is a perfect analogy for what we're talking about, because look at who's accusing him and who's like raising this. So, look at what Muhammad has said, what he has said about what he's done, as if like it's so obvious that, of course no one could travel to, Aqsa, to Jerusalem, and then to the heavens. How impossible? Like, what is that based on? Like, how do you know it's impossible? Like, what have you, do you have access to revelation? Like, because they believed in Allah, right? They believed in Allah. Many of the mushrikeen believed in Allah, actually. So they have that conception, but on what basis do you have this doubt? Do you presume to know exactly everything about the way the world is and the way the universe works and what's possible, and conceivable? Like, how arrogant and how stupid! Like, illogical, right? So why would I? And that's the same. That's a perfect parallel and analog to what science today, right? It's so limited. It's such a small sliver of what exists, and because science doesn't know what it doesn't know, right? Okay, so before the discovery of X-rays and electromagnetic waves, right? Human beings had no conception that the entire world around them was filled with all of this electromagnetic radiation, and that it's a completely, like, if you see pictures from NASA, right, and they have like these images that they capture where they're detecting, okay, what's the radio signals coming from the sun? What's the infrared spectrum that's coming from the sun? What's the ultraviolet? All these different ranges within the electromagnetic spectrum, and you get completely different images, right? And depending on what part of the electromagnetic spectrum you're detecting and you're exploring. And so that's literally like you have different aspects of the world that were revealed to you, like that you were not privy to in the least just 200 years ago, just 150 years ago. But you're still like waxing poetic and strutting around like like what the universe is all about, and we just have to figure out these small little details, but it's pretty much all solved. No, that's so arrogant and illogical. Like, even if someone wasn't coming from a theistic or Muslim perspective, it would be illogical, it'd be irrational. But this is exactly what they're peddling to people, and it's beyond faith, it's just stupidity. And so when I hear, this narration about Abu Bakr, it just fills me with wonder and gratitude. Like, this is these are the Sahaba, these are the Muslims that we aspire to be, both, externally with our actions, but also internally in their understanding. So yeah, that's a very apt thing that you're bringing up here in this discussion.
Yeah, and subhanAllah, that same generation changed the world forever. So they probably knew something.
Yeah, to say the least.
To say the least, yeah, subhanAllah. Yeah. Daniel, always a pleasure to have you on, and really interesting topic. And of course, we it's hard to do justice to some of these subject matters, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase us. And of course, I hope people reflect and do their own research and learning, and I think part of wisdom is to also accept humility and the mystery, and that some things can't fully be known. And if we're going to put our chips on the table for something, obviously if you're a believer in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger, that's probably the safest bet to make, as far as this is the narrative that we want to use and harness to help us construct reality, and not the other way around.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, Barakallahu feek. Barakallahu feekum to the listeners as well. Thank you for having me.
Inshallah, see, akramakum Allah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Karim Sirajuddin here. Thank you for tuning in. Please visit nurhuman.com to learn more about how I provide personal, spiritual, and relationship counsel. Please generously help sponsor this show to keep on going at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. That's patreon.com/coffeewithkareem.